Hey everyone, today I will be presenting my economic research paper, a systematic literature review of the trade-off between employment and inflation and how it affects the market economy. Abstract. This study intends to evaluate the trade-off between employment and inflation and how it affects the market economy, as well as the factors and elements influencing employment and inflation. A systematic review without meta-analysis was followed in documenting the study. The data source used to obtain relevant information was a variety of articles, studies, and literature. Higher inflation would have an indirect negative impact on job creation in the long run, indicating that lower inflation is preferable. While there was no strong evidence of a short-run positive effect of inflation on job creation, the undeniable long-run negative impact should deter policymakers from attempting to exploit any potential short-run trade-off. Exchange rates, money supply, fuel prices, and gold prices all have a significant impact on inflation. Introduction. Employment is a two-party contract that governs the provision of paid labor services. Typically, one party, the employer, which could be a corporation, a non-profit organization, a cooperative, or any other entity, pays the other, the employee, in exchange for performing assigned work. Meanwhile, inflation is the gradual loss of purchasing power of a given currency. The increase in an economy's average price level of a basket of selected goods and services over time can be used to calculate a quantitative estimate of the rate at which buying power falls. A rise in the general level of prices, often expressed as a percentage, means that a unit of currency buys less than before. Historically, the relationship between inflation and unemployment has been inverse. This relationship, however, is more complicated than it appears at first glance, and it has broken down several times over the last 50 years. One of the first economists to present compelling evidence of the inverse relationship between unemployment and wage inflation was A.W. Phillips. Phillips studied the relationship between unemployment and wage growth in the United Kingdom for nearly a century, from 1861 to 1957. And he discovered that the latter could be explained by two factors, unemployment level and an unemployment range of change. Phillips hypothesized that when labor demand is high and there are few unemployed workers, employers can expect wages to rise quickly. However, when labor demand is low and unemployment is high, workers are hesitant to accept lower wages than the prevailing rate, and wage rate falls slowly as a result. The rate of change in unemployment is a second factor that influences wage rate changes. If the economy is booming, employers will bid more aggressively for workers, indicating that demand for labor is increasing quickly than they would if demand for labor was either not increasing or increasing slowly. Wages and salaries are major input costs for businesses, so rising wages should result in higher prices for goods and services in an economy, pushing the overall inflation rate higher. As a result, Phillips drew a graph depicting the relationship between general price inflation and unemployment rather than wage inflation. This study was conducted to be able to review the literature on the relationship between employment and inflation. Its specific objective is to describe the trade-off between inflation and employment, assess how inflation and employment affect the market economy, identify the factors and elements influencing employment and inflation. This research aims to contribute to the knowledge of the investors, business owners, consumers, and the general public regarding the relationship between employment and inflation, how it affects the economy, and what significant factors of employment and inflation are to be considered in making a business decision. The research findings would improve the decision-making of investors and business owners that could directly make an impact on their investment strategies and business operations. Companies may also use these findings to reduce expenses, uncover new projects, and detect wasteful business processes. This research may also effectively benefit students and future researchers. Having said that, the primary focus of this study will be the relationship between employment and inflation. Next is the methodology. This paper conducts a literature review on employment and inflation. They prepared reporting items for systematic reviews in meta-analysis, PRISMA, and systematic review with a meta-analysis, SWIM. Guidelines were then followed when documenting systematic reviews. So I use the SPICE framework: setting, employment and inflation, perspective, general public, intervention, any intervention where employment and inflation are tackled, comparison among trends of employment and inflation, evaluation, relationship of employment and inflation. The SPICE framework, settings, perspective, intervention, comparison, and evaluation was used to develop the research question, which aims to explain the relationships between employment and inflation, describe the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, examine how inflation and unemployment affects the market economy, and determine the factors and elements influencing employment and inflation. Results and discussion. So this is the summary of journals. First is written by Bermulan C., published year 2015, titled "A Relationship Between Inflation and Unemployment, a Theoretical Discussion About the Belief Curves." This paper discusses inflation and unemployment as integral components of a market economy, including the socio-economic consequences which may actually impact the public. Next is the nexus between inflation and unemployment evidence from Indonesia. Published in year 2019, the purpose of this paper was to study the relationship between inflation and the unemployment rate in Indonesia from 1987 to 2018. Third is the analysis of factors affecting inflation and its impact on Human Development Index and poverty in Indonesia. Published year 2017. This paper focuses on the effect of currency exchange rates, supply of money, fuel prices, and gold prices on the inflation, as well as its impact on human development and poverty, was explored in this research. Fourth is the employment and poverty in the Philippines, published in 2015. The purpose of this study is to examine employment market performance in the Philippines from the standpoint of workers' welfare. Next one is the Philippine Report on Employment Trends and Policies in the Duterte Administration and Contractualization, published in year 2017. This paper focuses on employment trends as well as labor policy pronouncements on contractual employment and regularization. Next is the Unemployment and Inflation Implications for Policy Making, written by Mark Labonte and published in 2016. This paper discussed the factors influencing inflation, the impact of inflation on economic growth, and the differences between long-term and short-term unemployment and inflation. Last one is the COVID-19 pandemic and unemployment dynamics in European economics, published last 2021. This study focuses on the trend of unemployment in European countries considering the COVID-19 pandemic. So, let's discuss the trade-off between employment and inflation. According to Bermulan, in an employment market with substantial skill shortage, higher educational attainment is required, and labor demand may not always translate into a lower unemployment rate. This is because not all new entrants in the labor market are employable in the response to increased labor demand. It was concluded that higher inflation would have an indirect negative impact on job creation in the long run, and the lower inflation is thus preferable. While there was no strong evidence of short-run positive effect of inflation on employment creation, the undeniable long-run negative impact should discourage policymakers from attempting to exploit any possible short-run trade-off. According to Wolandari, Otomo, Namaditya, and Kamaluddin, the rate of inflation varies wildly in response to the shock of unemployment. The unemployment rate initially increased in response to the rate of inflation shocks, but somehow, it eventually decreased, demonstrate that the shocks caused by the inflation rate are only temporary. Next is the assessment on how inflation and unemployment affects the market economy. Economists have discovered that when the unemployment rate falls below a certain level, known as the natural rate, the inflation rate rises and continues to rise until the unemployment rate returns to its natural rate. In contrast, when the unemployment rate rises above the natural rate, then inflation rate tends to slow. The natural rate of unemployment is that which is consistent with long-term economic growth. When the unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate, the economy is developing faster than its maximum sustainable rate, putting upward pressure on wages and prices in general, resulting in higher inflation. If the unemployment rate rises above the natural rate, downward pressure is applied to wages and prices in general, resulting in lower inflation. Wages account for a significant portion of cost of goods and services. Therefore, wage pressure pushes average prices in the same direction. Next is the factors and elements influencing employment and inflation. To Yolanda, exchange rate, supply of money, fuel prices, and gold prices are the factors that affect inflation significantly. This significant According to Yolanda, exchange rates, supply of money, fuel prices, and gold prices are the factors that affect inflation significantly. This signifies that inflation is a disease in a country's economy that influences all economic activities. So, lastly is the conclusion. Labor sector developments, particularly the level of unemployment in the economy, are critical to the conduct of monetary policy. It has been demonstrated both theoretically and empirically that there is a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. On the other hand, this literature implies that higher unemployment or real shocks will not result in large inflationary movements. If, on the other hand, inflation remains the above target, bringing it down to the desired level would imply increased employment and output volatility. Also, unemployment rate is an important indicator of the economic performance. A falling unemployment rate is usually associated with rising GDP, higher wages, and higher industrial production because the government can generally achieve a lower unemployment rate through expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. It is reasonable to expect policymakers to consistently target a lower unemployment rate through these policies. So that's all. Thank you for listening.